Now that's it for this course section. This section was about forms and specifically forms which we expose to our website visitors. We already had a look at the admin panel in an earlier course section, but the admin panel is there for us as the website owner to manage some of the data which only we should manage, like for example our blog posts or the products in an online shop. But we also often have data like reviews, feedback, comments, data like this, which of course has to be generated by the visitors of our webpage, by our users, not by us. And in such scenarios, we need to expose forms to our visitors and we need to handle them. Now you learned how you can build a form from scratch in HTML in one of your templates, and how you can handle it from scratch in your view by manually validating it, by manually extracting the data, and by then manually using that data. Whilst that is possible and sometimes might be enough, it can be cumbersome to do that all on your own. That's why we have this form class provided by Django from which we can inherit, which allows us to build our own form class where we define our own form controls. We can give them our own labels, validation logic, and possible error messages that should be shown. And more, of course. As always, you can dive into full documentation to read about all the possible options and arguments you can pass to those controls. Now, with such a form class, we have the huge advantage that we can easily generate the HTML code that belongs to this form. We can either generate the form as a whole or individual parts of the form, like the label field, the input field itself, the errors part, and then we can really build the template as we need it, but we don't need to write all the HTML code from scratch. But that's just one of the advantages we get when using these forms as provided by Django. Another major advantage can be seen in our views. There, we now don't have to manually pull out the data and validate the data and do something with it. Instead, when using a form class, inheriting from Django's form, we can just pass the received data to that form class to instantiate this class, and then we can call methods like isValid to easily validate all the data with the rules we configured when we configured the form class. That then allows us to easily render and return different responses based on the validity, and if the data is valid, we also have easy access to the cleaned data. For example, to then store that in one of our models and therefore in the database. But if that's our use case, getting data for one of our models, then we can simplify this even more. Because for this, Django gives us this model form instead of the regular form from which we can inherit. When doing that, we still get a form class which we can use, like the other form class, but we don't even need to define our controls there, our form input elements. Instead, we just tell Django which controls, which fields from our model we want to have as controls, if that should be all, or just a selected list of fields, or maybe all fields but some excluded ones. We can still configure them regarding their labels and error messages, but then we have Django infer our form controls from our model. We can then still output those form controls in a template, and when it comes to saving that data, we still validate it as we used to, but we don't have to create a new instance of our model now and pass the form data into it. Instead, we can call save on the form itself if it's based on such a model form, and that will then automatically save it to the database, either as a brand new data entry, or if we set that instance keyword argument and we point at an existing instance of our model, it will then update that model. So update that data entry in the database with the form data. And that's all very convenient and can save us a lot of time and code. And then last but not least in this section, we got started with class-based views. And I explained that you can replace your view functions with class-based views that inherit from Django's built-in view templates, so to say, view blueprints, if you want to call them like this. With that, you can, for example, inherit from the generic view to have a class where you define get and post methods, and possibly other HTTP verbs as well. And then Django will automatically call the correct method for you depending on which kind of request is reaching that view. You still point at that view in your URLs py file like this, but then if the same URL is reached with different HTTP methods, the different methods in your view will be called. And you don't have to add a if check in your view function to find out whether it's a post or a get request. So that can also make your code more structured. We're going to dig deeper into those class-based views in the next course section, but for this section we now learned about this very important forms feature, and we got started with those class-based views.